And I just want to say huge good morning. This may be one of the last few times we would meet formally like this. This is the last module of the Early Career Faculty Institute. I can't believe our time has come to an end together in this forum. And, if you just kind of reflect on everything we've done from the time you came for new faculty orientation and all the various modules we did together, the cohort, peer group, the ideas, the exchange, of everything that happened here, writing salons, and kind of going through a curriculum bit by bit that helps you pull everything together, and the resources that you now know of that exist in this very complicated university. The other wonderful thing about this cohort is that we have both tenure track and clinical faculty or contract faculty, and I really wish you could be ambassadors and make more people on both sides come to this, because you won't realize it now, but in 2 years we can go back to your bright space and say, these are excellent examples of blah blah blah, right? So I hope that you've gained from this as much as we have, and it's been a pleasure to offer this to you. And we have a really exciting panel today with 3 wonderful faculty who've done so much work in the realm of GIDBEA, and even that keeps changing, and I want you to comment on that. One day it's IDBEA, DEI, but anyway, I'm going to introduce the 3 panelists, and maybe we can keep this interactive, so feel free to talk and ask questions as they are speaking. And I'll kick off with a couple of questions and we can take it.
You're not going to read all the...
I'm not going to read all of that. I'm going to just tell them the titles, and maybe you can jump in with the main things about yourselves. So we have Dr. Dana Verdi. She's an associate professor and director of the International Education Program at Steinhardt. And her work, I think she's really known for her work in Afghanistan here at NYU, but she's done a lot of other global work. And after I finish my little spiel about each one, thank you, you could probably add a bit about your own backgrounds. Dr. Ann Morning is professor of sociology at NYU with expertise in race, ethnicity, and sociology of science. And I heard her talk about her book and how beautifully she talks about race. And so I invited her here to kind of talk more about her work there and how it's viewed in other parts of the globe. But Dr. Morning also serves as a divisional dean for social sciences and vice dean for global and strategic initiatives here at NYU. And finally, we have Dr. Cheryl Antonio, who is also my neighbor, and I promised to tell us, I told her I'm going to promise this one thing about her. During COVID, I used to enjoy meeting her in the Sasaki Garden under the beautiful cherry blossoms for her history lessons. Okay, let her give you history lessons, a way that I used to hate history in school, right? And then I realized when someone can be so animated and make it so interesting, it's the best thing you can learn. So her history lessons, and through the lens of DEI today. But let me give you her official title. She's the Senior Associate Dean for Strategic Initiatives at Tisch and the recipient of the MLK Award. 3 times?
Once.
Okay. Sorry. 3 times served as chair
of the
recording music, Davis Institute of Recorded Music. Yeah. And with this, I will pass it over to you. And if you want to say a little bit more about your backgrounds, and then we kick off with the first question, which is to talk a little bit about your professional trajectories. Okay.
So would you like us to start first talking about our backgrounds each, and then
and a little bit about your trajectories,
professional trajectories, and then move to the
Sure. And I want to keep it informal, so it doesn't have to be in line.
Sure.
Cheryl can be first sometimes and not last. Great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So let me see. I think that understanding my trajectory starts with understanding that I was a late bloomer in academia. So I actually didn't think I wanted to go into academia at all after I completed my PhD. I thought, it's time to go out and do something else, partly because when I finished my PhD, I had a number of jobs lined up, that I was prepared to do, but September 11th, I finished my PhD in May 2001, and I was here in New York. I was doing my degree at Columbia, and then you know what happened September 2001, September 11th. Everything changed, obviously, for many people, and for me that meant that suddenly I was focused on understanding questions related to international aid to education. This was what I focused on for my PhD, and I was focused on understanding those questions in a place where all of the aid was going at the time, which was Afghanistan. So I had previously worked in Latin America and in the Caucasus, and I had lots of practitioner and academic insights into questions related to access to education, even in the midst of conflict. So this is what I had focused my dissertation research on, which I had completed in Bosnia. And then suddenly I found myself in this new world where a huge amount of aid and military intervention as well was going towards Afghanistan. And I wanted to understand better how to support access to education even in the midst of conflict and crisis. So I started to get grants. I started winning grants to study this question in Afghanistan, and that ended up being a long-term academic trajectory, a long-term research agenda that I keep trying to perhaps move a little bit away from, but get drawn back in because of the events in the region, and also because of a fundamental commitment to those who are part of my research studies. So that is one of the key themes in my work, and one of the key themes that I'll talk about here is understanding how to be an outsider who can help share and amplify voices of local communities in ways that benefit those communities and honor their diversity.
Great. So maybe to pick up a thread of Dana's, so like you, I also wasn't planning to be an academic. That was not my plan. When I was in college, I was really, really interested in pursuing a career in international affairs. So after college, I went and did a master's in international affairs at Columbia. Like you. And when I graduated, I went to work actually for the New York Federal Reserve Bank as an economist. That I worked in a division which analyzed the external debt burdens of developing countries. And from there, I took the Foreign Service exam and I passed it and joined the U.S. Foreign Service. So I was, well on my, track of an international affairs career. I was posted first to Tegucigalpa, Honduras. And then from Honduras, I served at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. But I was, in many ways, I could talk more, it's very interesting work in many ways, but I was starting to realize that I would be more drawn to some kind of work where I could do research, because what happened in the Foreign Service was, they sort of threw you into a country with really no knowledge of the country, where, like basically what you learned, it was like they might as well have just handed you like, let's go Honduras and, guidebook, and you flip through it and you were good to go. So there was very little investment in getting to know the place, the society you were serving in. There was much more emphasis on just the tasks of the job, like learning the immigration law that you would be enforcing as somebody, starting out as a junior Foreign Service officer, you were basically a visa officer. So there was a lot more emphasis on just learning immigration law. And so in the course of that, while again, it was a very interesting work in a lot of ways, I realized that I wanted to do work where I could actually delve into a problem, understand something, spend some time researching it. And so I started to think I really would like to do something else. And as luck would have it, the dean of the School of International Public Affairs, the Master of International Affairs program, I bumped into him at the UN, and he was like, we're looking for a new assistant dean. Would you be interested? And I thought, okay, here's my bridge. So I left the Foreign Service. I worked for a couple of years at SIPA as the School of International Public Affairs as a dean, and really used that time to basically just prepare for graduate school, taking the GREs. I took some math classes that I thought I would need, that kind of thing. And I ultimately decided to do a PhD with a focus in demography, because I realized I'd sort of developed this interest in questions around racial classification, which would end up being the mainstay of my work as an academic. But at that time, it was just kind of a side interest that I had. So anyway, long story short, so I started a PhD at Princeton in sociology and demography. And again, even there, I wasn't planning to be an academic. I just thought, well, this is great. I'll be trained up to be a researcher. I'll go to Washington and I'll work for a think tank. But what happens is, you know, you probably have experienced, once you kind of get into the academic world, you're kind of reeled in, right? And you know, because your advisors, of course, are all thinking, you know, or many of them anyway, are thinking that you're going to be a replica of them. So their plan for you is to become a professor. No,
no,
you see what I'm saying, right?
I
So
got
get it.
I
Yes,
PTSD
it's
from
right,
that.
right. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So even though I'm thinking, oh no, I'm not going to be a professor, they're all thinking, oh, you're going to be a professor. So, you know, and you get really, and you're like, oh, well, I'll submit this article for publication, and oh, well, there's the job market. Well, I'll just throw my hat in and see what I get, you know, that kind of thing. So long story short, so I, you know, ended up going on the market, taking a job at NYU. I've been here for 20 years. This is my 20 year. I came through as an assistant professor, and you know, and I have to say, like, while I've had opportunities to consider jobs elsewhere, for me, no other place has offered, I think, the kind of globally oriented university that I'm interested in being in. Plus, I have to say, I'm a native New Yorker. It's also very nice being in my hometown. But I think even more importantly, for me, my academic career at NYU has really been integrally tied up with the global network that NYU has. It's given me a lot of opportunities. Adain and I know each other from teaching multiple times at NYU Abu Dhabi. So that's been great. I've taught also at NYU Florence. I'm going at the end of this week to give a talk at NYU Berlin. In January I was at NYU Madrid. I truly appreciate that very international profile of our university, and it's been meaningful to me academically. So that's sort of how I came to this. And I think, Iti, you want us to talk later about how the research that we do intersects with that. We'll come to that later?
Right,
or?
yeah.
Okay, so I'll hold off
reframe
on.
and I'll ask my question.
Yes, so I'll pass it on to Cheryl. Yeah.
An academic is one of the things I am. Just one. I had no intention of becoming an academic at all. Graduated from undergrad film and television, went into the television business, wanted to be a producer, got 2 jobs, one at ABC, one at NBC. Hated it. Your dream comes true and you're absolutely miserable. It's soul crushing. They don't care about art. They don't care about people. They don't care about diversity. My whole family and I had a breakdown because they spent all this money to send me to graduate from the best film school at NYU, and I hated it. So it was like, what am I going to do?
So what do they care about? Money?
Yeah, no. They just thought I loved it so much, but they didn't understand that what I loved about it was not there. So that was hard at 21 to make that decision. I had intended, because all of my predecessors had gone out in the business, got burned out, and went back to get degrees and would change their life. And I thought, well, what was I interested in? And I knew I would have teaching as part of my life when I hit my 50s, but here I am in my 20s thinking of changing my whole life. So what I did was I said, well, if I want to be a producer with my research in the industry, I can produce. Directors and writers need to be doing it full-time. Producers can do this. So if I'm a full-time faculty earlier than I thought, I could produce during my off times. So I went back to New York University, couldn't afford the degree, so I got a job, turns out in the film department, to get free tuition. Really long story short, I took an MA in literature, religion, and psychology because I was interested, not history, because I was not well represented by history. I wanted to know where stories came from. Where did stories come from? I knew how to make stories, but where do they come from and why do they exist? So I took literature, religion, and psychology and went way outside my field. For instance, I studied German literature because I loved Kafka and Dostoevsky. Like anything I didn't know, I didn't understand is where I went, nothing familiar. Really long story short, it took 18 years to get the master's and PhD. I became a dean. I started as a receptionist in my position so I could go to school at 6 o'clock because you could leave at 5. this was in 1981. In 1994, I became a dean. I did not complete my PhD until 1999. So what it turns out happening, which I didn't know, was that I was using my producing skills as dean. You know, black woman becomes dean of the greatest film school in the world, job I wanted to retire from. And my PhD was kind of a weird situation. I took all my 3 degrees are from NYU, and I've been here 42 years. My PhD is in African American cinema in a department that had no black faculty and no African American cinema on the syllabus. So I created it. I created it building the road as I'm driving on it. That's the metaphor. So nothing scares me anymore. What I did was I studied American cinema and the absence of blackness, the absence of African American cinema. And I created my own exams. And I actually started teaching. I guess this is when my academic seed was planted. I actually started teaching in 1992 before I became dean, and continued until I finished my PhD, the first class on African American cinema at Tisch, because I had amassed so much information I needed to share it with my community. So that's how my work began. Then I became a full-time faculty member after I completed my PhD, but I kept up with my role as dean because it fed me. I realized, too late, that actually in life you don't have to choose, which is why I said an academic is one of the things I am. One. I'm an administrator because I love solving problems, and if you're an administrator at Tisch, you can participate in the problem solving. I write academic stuff and other stuff, and I'm a photographer. And one of the things that was really important to me in my career, because I also now run all the free arts programs that we offer at Tisch and during the summer, was that my work be available not just in academic journals and in book form, but on the internet. Because I needed to be part of the biggest world. I think that seed was planted because I was born in the third world. And when you're in the third world, you grow up in the third world, you kind of grow up understanding everything but yourself. And I only understood where I came from after I left it, because while I was there, I'm from the island of Jamaica. So I was sent to a British Catholic school and found out nothing about myself and had to study myself when I was doing my MA. So, IDBEA, ABCD, LGBTQIA plus, all of that, is part of life. And once the blinders were taken off for me, I never put them back on. Thank you.
Thank you. That's excellent. I feel like I've known all of you and still didn't know so much about you. And this is great. So my next question is just about what aspects of all your work, scholarship, teaching, administration, right? You can speak from all those angles or any one specific angle. How do you apply, or how does it, I'm not even saying you're applying those principles necessarily, it just embodies a GIDBEA. So if you can each talk about that a bit, and of course a little bit more about your book in that question. So I think that's going to cover a lot of this. What I'm trying to do here is the OGI, the office, has a lot of resources. They have a lot of trainings. But here are faculty who actually will talk about how their work applies it on a daily basis, basically. And that's why I think it's really important for you to get faculty perspectives. So anyone can go.
It's my job now, I would say, GIBDEA.
Yes.
It wasn't my job. After I was Dean of Film and Television, I wanted to step down, and you go out while the going's good, right? Like, it's not going to get better than this, but actually it did. The reason this is my job now is because everything I was doing on the side as part of my life and my identity were requested of me to do as a central function of the school. So now I oversee, again, all the free programs that all of the Tisch departments, undergraduate departments run. free. Like NYU has free programs on Saturdays in all of our undergraduate departments at Tisch. So tell everybody. We have some programs that we do in the summer. I work with our Dean of Diversity, and I just feel like my job is to keep the door open for people who don't think they want to come to NYU or have access to NYU. And actually, like literally people who don't understand how education is power. And also people who don't understand that their lives are important, that they're important. My whole life has been research. My life existence has been essential research that I have used in my work, my experiences, right? We think IDBEA, education, everything is out there. It's not, it's in here, right? And I didn't learn that. And in fact, I wouldn't have learned that so quickly if I didn't go to an art school. Because you realize in art school that all your production comes from you. You're a filter and a lens. And when you understand that you're that filter and that lens, then you begin to use it. But no one gives you permission to call on who you are and what you know. Well, they did for me in art school, and I used it in the rest of my career. To the point where one of the things when the dean at the time asked me to become dean, I was 34 years old. I was living a good life, having fun. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm not dean material. And she said, well, what do you think dean material is? I had it stereotyped, of course, academic. How did I know deans? Deans don't talk to people. They're not fun. They're not funny. They wear suits. I have never worn a matched suit, unless I have to. I said, I'm just not up for that. And she said, you don't have to be. You can be you in that position. So I accepted it, and I accepted the position. But really, my work, my teaching, my everything has to do with the fact that people are important. That people's lives, everyone experiences what I call difference. The class I teach now is called The Anatomy of Difference. I teach it culturally through films. It's called Anatomy of Difference, the other through film. But every one of us at some point and in some context feels different, feels like an outsider, doesn't feel good enough. And if you understand these principles, then you could move agilely, but include yourself in your own curiosity, right? My problem was a little bit different. So I started with issues in contemporary African American cinema. I'm a Black woman. The expectation is I know a lot of Black stuff, but nothing else. So my journey was actually, to expand my work and to teach the undergraduate course, The Language of Film, right? And I have a book out now called Dramatic Effects with a Movie Camera, because that's my discipline. That's my academic field and my educational discipline. And then I'm very invested in writing. So I also taught the freshman class, The World Through Art. But all my work includes culture. Culture doesn't exist outside of our work. How you include it, when you include it, is up to you. But culture does not exist outside of our work. And now I'm back to teaching something that I completely believe in, which is that the arts dialogue with culture all the time and can expose our flaws, show our future. I just did a lecture for some incoming students. I had this thing my whole life that I never clicked with until I saw the series Watchmen. And the thing I loved about Watchmen and so many works of art is they converse with a future and a past at the same time. And then I rehashed my own work all over again and realized, and after I realized these things, I want to share it with people. So I created this lecture called Afro-Pessimism and Afrofuturism, right? Multiple truths. It's not either or, it's both. And the arts want to talk to everybody. And that's how I learned. I want to talk to everybody. Right? And so my venue for you is to watch Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Danger of a Single Story. Because when we look at each other, there's some stuff we learned that we haven't unlearned. And we make assumptions about each other when we look at each other. So my job is to undo that and really find out who people are and open the door to other people. And that's my work, whether I'm teaching, writing, with the little kids this summer that I'm going to be with the little kids. And I love it because it is who I am. And I used to do it voluntarily when I was dean of film and television. And this new dean asked me to do it for the whole school. So how bad can that be? So here I am. Thank you.
Wow. Maybe I'll go. So I guess for me, thinking about sort of the intersection of what I do with IDBA, I see it in two levels. So one, certainly the research and teaching that I do are quite related, and then at the same time, the sorts of service or administrative work I do also is connected. So just very briefly on the kind of research side, research and teaching side, I'm a sociologist of race and ethnicity, and so I'm continually I'm teaching about and I'm writing about questions of race that are all really connected to concerns around equality and justice. So, I do what I do the research I do the teaching I do with that fundamental underpinning of thinking about how do we combat racial inequalities and injustice. And there are two particular areas that I work and teach on. So one, I do a lot of work related to racial and ethnic classification. So I'm really interested in how states, how governments classify people, put people in boxes like on censuses, the implications that has for people's lives, the choices that individuals make also about where to put themselves in these boxes and what that means for their own identities, their senses of self and of being seen or not. Some of you may know that just recently the US government, like in the last 2 weeks, the US government announced a change to our system of racial and ethnic classification. And I should say also, the US is a weird country in that we have an official set of categories, of racial and ethnic categories. Most places don't have that, but we do establish that. And we've recently changed them in the last 2 weeks to, for the first time, create categories for Hispanic or Latino to figure as a category on our race question. On our census, and also to create a new category for people of Middle Eastern and North African descent. So these are categories that are always changing. They vary, how they might look in different countries. And so I'm just very interested in why we have these categories and what they mean in people's lives. The other area that I do research on is racial conceptualization. And by that I mean basically the beliefs that everyday people have about what race is. So kind of the answers that we have in our heads to questions like, what is race? What races are there out there? How are they different from each other? Where do races come from? The kind of working models that we have in our heads about what we think race is. And as Niti mentioned, I'm interested in this not just in the United States, but also globally. In my most recent book was a comparison of the ways in which Americans think about it and the ways in which Europeans, particularly in Italy, are thinking about this. So I'm very interested in that. And the bottom line, the rationale for doing this kind of work is because those ideas that we have, the sort of unreflected ideas that we're carrying around in our heads that we don't necessarily examine, they actually have an impact on how we think it's possible, or whether it's possible or desirable to arrive at a situation of racial equality, to combat racial inequalities. In a nutshell, if we think that what races are these, discrete, separate biological clusters of people, then we tend to think that racial differences are hardwired, they're fixed, there's nothing we can do. And any sorts of differences in outcomes that we observe between racial groups in society must be a product of their genes or their blood or whatever it is that we think divides people by race. But if, conversely, we really understand how racial and ethnic categories are socially constructed ones, they're groupings that we make up and that we're constantly making and remaking, like the census shows, then we understand that there's nothing about these groups that's hardwired. And then that opens up all kinds of possibilities into envisioning different kinds of societies, right? A society that doesn't have the sorts of racial hierarchies and differences that we observe in the US and in other places as well today. So basically the research that I'm doing in this area is really fundamentally tied to questions of inclusion and equity. But also outside the research part, on the kind of administrative and service side, I've always been very involved in promoting, I'll say diversity, because before we expanded it into GIDBEA, I think kind of the code word or the byword was diversity. I think throughout my academic career, I've always been very concerned with issues of who's in the room and who's not in the room. Who, particularly through our hiring processes as academics, when we get together as a faculty and make decisions, we vote on who we want to hire into our departments. who is on our long list, who is on our short list, who are we considering seriously, who are we not even really spending time talking about because we're not really taking their candidacy seriously. So I've always been kind of in my department, kind of a gadfly to the department, saying, well, guys, why do we have a list that looks like this? Why aren't we talking seriously about this candidate or that candidate? So that throughout my academic career has been important to me. And now in the position that I have now as a divisional dean, I get to also intervene in those processes in a different way, that I'm now part of a formal process where, we ask departments, to tell us, what are the statistics in their discipline? So what's the kind of diversity to be found in their disciplines as a whole? What did their candidate pools look like? Who applied to the job? What was the diversity of the makeup in that? Who did they select from that pool for their long list, and who did they select from the long list for the short list? So we have a mechanism in arts and science where we, at different steps, are really just sort of asking departments to be mindful and pay attention to how they may inadvertently be winnowing people out at different stages from the pools that they have. So that's really, satisfying to me. And we will maybe even talk a little bit later about, how we work towards, diversity in these areas. But I'll say that I think a lot of the work that I do, or the approach that I've taken in this historically, is it's often just about pointing out to people the implicit ways, the ways that they're not even aware of, but in which they are sidelighting certain groups of people. And I can give you two concrete examples. About 10 years ago in my department in sociology, we ran a search where we interviewed 10 candidates, all of whom were white, 8 of whom were men. Nobody in my department of sociologists, right? I'm not talking about like astrophysicists who are like not thinking about, or sociologists. Nobody seemed to notice what a skewed pool of candidates we had brought in. When I pointed this out, people were like, oh my goodness, So a lot of believe it or not. So, or more recently, I did an example where someone in an office here at NYU sort of promoted a brochure about research, and it was showing researchers and scientists, again, pretty much all white scientists. And I was like, we're sending the message that we're not really supporting and they're like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize. So I have this experience again and again where people are like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize. And the good thing about that is that, you can say, you can point it out politely, but then also try to enlist people and say, look, I know you weren't meaning to be exclusionary, but let's rethink this together. How could we showcase other people or send the message to a wider community about, wanting to, really recruit people from all backgrounds, different talents, and all of that. So although my title is not formally like Cheryl, so focused on it, there are many, many opportunities in which, in the work that I do, I not only can be mindful myself of these issues, but really it's about, putting it on the table for your wider community of colleagues, and in a way where you don't alienate them, but kind of can enlist them as allies and bring them on board, with you. And that's a sort of a diplomatic balancing act in that work. So maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
Would you like my water? I haven't touched it. I have my own. 'Cause
Sure.
yours is finished.
Thank you very
Pleasure.
much. So thank you, Anne. It's so wonderful to hear. And also how you used your diplomacy skills from way back when. I'm going to just take a look at my notes also because I'm a little bit sleep deprived, I confess. I have 2 little ones, and they were both coming to our bed. They both got into our bed at 4 a.m. So I'm a little, and I bet many of you probably have little ones at home. Or maybe some of you, so you can relate. I know.
You can relate,
exactly, right? Yeah. So
My little one has a tail.
Your little one has a tail.
It can be the worst, right?
And still wakes us up early.
That's great. So I'd like to describe the way my work influences my teaching and my administration in one word for the moment, and that word is anti-othering.
Oh, that's good.
I feel like, and by the way, I don't know if that's a thing or not, but it just occurred to me this morning as I was making notes for this talk. And I feel like what I do is I try to do radical anti-othering, actually. And I do this because I mentioned a little bit briefly about my background, but I have spent probably half of my adult life living outside of the United States and learning other languages and really living and deeply experiencing other places and people and cultural norms. And in that process, I've come face to face, or really been my preconceptions have been challenged in every kind of way imaginable. Living in some of the most different places on the planet to New York, like Quetta, Pakistan. Anyone? Is anyone familiar with Balochistan in Pakistan? It's one of the most conservative, socially conservative places on the planet, I would say. And now that's and by the way, this kind of for me and maybe for others on the panel, the professional and the personal intermix.
Yep.
So that also coincidentally happens to be where my husband is from. My in-laws live there. So it's not something that I just professionally embody, but also I would say personally. And as part of my efforts towards anti-othering, my syllabi always include authors who come from other places, authors who write about people who look and sound and act different from our students, but also who represent to the students and all of our community. Let me see, how do I characterize this? The same kind of variation, so radical othering, but also the same kind of variations that we have in our own societies. So I find that people, and what I've spent a lot of time on in my, let me back up. What I spend a lot of time on in my career is focusing on writing about, thinking about, and talking about Islam. As I mentioned, my work started in Latin America, moved to the Balkans, the Caucasus. I had many realizations, epiphanies along the way, particularly about how communities live in the midst of conflict and how people think of that differently who are living in peace. Even these differences between populations living in peace. Imagine folks living in war as always in war, which is not the case. War and conflict is incredibly uneven. You can have even on a single block, one block might be terribly affected by a conflict, and the next block may actually be just okay. Someone who lives on one side of let's say the green zone might wake up in the morning and think, oh, okay, I can't cross to the other side today because where my school is having bombardment, but I'm going to just stay home today because otherwise I would go to school because of this. Yes, please.
Where in the Caucasus were you?
I lived in Armenia.
I'm from Georgia.
Oh, I can say Erti Orisami, but I can't say much more than that. I mean, one, two, three in Georgian. Živeli, I can say Živeli also, which means, right? It's a toast. So yes, I worked in Georgia also. I spent time in Tbilisi and Baku as well, yeah. But, so yeah, I was there just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, actually, and saw things change radically, right? But how this affects my teaching is that, as I said, I really started to focus on differences in understandings of the other. And in my research, I spent quite a bit of time debunking Western notions of Islam and Western misunderstandings of Islam that have to do with the reasons, why some societies try to seclude women, for example. The misunderstandings about the way Muslim societies, the misunderstandings about the way they value education. In the West, when I started my research in Afghanistan, many people here thought Muslims, these very broad terms used to talk about an entire huge billions of people, right? There's incredible variation in the Muslim world as there is here, but these misconceptions about the way Muslims think about education for girls, just fundamentally, deeply flawed, and that persists. I find that persists today because of the Taliban reemerging. I know Hedy knows this well also. The Taliban reemerging in Afghanistan and the very strict laws, anti-girls education laws they've put into place. But that is actually, it's not based in Islam. So in my work, I in class, I don't talk about they. My macro level intentions of anti-othering are also manifested in very small linguistic changes. I don't talk about they. They do this in a certain country. I think pronouns can sometimes mask, they always mask enormous variation, and they can also mask this us versus them. They are like this, we are like that. I also don't use other kinds of linguistic turns of phrase that I find inappropriate if one is really deeply about anti-othering. The last thing I'll add is about administration and mentoring. In my field, I started a journal called the Journal on Education in Emergencies, and also worked on that very closely with Hedy, who is sitting here in the room with us. And together we shaped this journal, which has now been going for 10 years and is the flagship journal for this small field called Education in Crisis, Conflict, and Emergencies. That journal made a policy of mentoring academics from low-income, middle-income countries. Mentoring is the wrong word. Providing resources to academics who work at under-resourced universities, who don't have access to research assistants, who don't have paid, sometimes even fully paid positions, right? They often will have to take another job. So we have sought out and encouraged scholarship from low-resource universities, low-income countries, not universities, low-income countries, conflict-affected countries, to ensure that we have representative voices publishing articles, academic articles, in our flagship journal for this small field.
Wonderful.
That's great. That's amazing. And I can't believe how quickly this hour is progressing. We have about a little less than 20 minutes left, and I have one burning question I have to ask, and then I really want people to jump in and ask questions, and that's about the values and the idea of GIDBEA in higher ed and how it's evolving now with all the challenges.
What's the G?
Global.
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 Oh, global.
Hadn't heard that yet.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was like, I need an answer.
They're right. Yeah.
So imagine me coming to NYU, third world kid, moved to America, born in 1960, moved to America in 1968, and coming to NYU in 1977. Not a lot of diversity. The irony is, in my Catholic school in the West Indies, there was every ethnicity because all the expats sent their kids there. So I went from being part of a very large global to a very small local, coming to New York University. But I came because my parents agreed it was the best film school in the world. Since understanding the change from the West Indies to America in 1968, I think global IDBEA has been part of every cell of my existence. Sometimes it's curiosity, sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's witness. It never leaves me. I'm a visible other because I look different. When I first arrived, I was an audio other because I sounded different, because the British forced you to pronounce your words. It doesn't matter what I'm doing, it's part of my existence. And If someone is being treated poorly, no matter what the context, I have a job. I don't know what that job is until my heart starts racing. I'm doing an event tonight that talks about being the artist as witness. I can tell you why I love the arts. I was listening to you talk, and it reminded me of why my field and young artists are important, and why providing resource, which we do through our free programs, is important. One of my colleagues, one of the things that we have to do at Tisch is prove that we're academics even when we make movies, that we're producing new knowledge even when we're creating art, that we're historians, right? So Carol Deisinger won an Oscar for a documentary film called Learning to Skateboard in a War Zone If You're a Girl. You know that.
I do.
Yeah. So, and so many people are being educated through smiling, through children, which I think are very pivotal subjects of art. So for me, when they created the title and created The Office, I'm like, yeah, whatevs. I've been doing that. I call it a different thing. I call it being me. I call it being mindful. I call it being kind. I call it being respectful. Right? It's how most of us live. It's nice that there's focus on it. It's nice that there's a framework. But, it's like they used to say that about church, that, these people go to church, but they don't live the word throughout the rest of the week. It doesn't matter what this stuff is. Do you live it? Do you embody it? Are you empathetic, sympathetic, generous? That's what it is. So the point being, going back, I was doing it in film and television. I've been doing it since I got here. Right? You see someone sitting quietly in a corner, not talking to anybody, you go over and talk to that person, right? Whatever. And so I'm thrilled because I didn't need this job. And by the way, here's the irony. It's changed so many times that I said, do not put the word diversity or any of those letters in my title. I have earned that right in arising to the position that I have. Said, I'm not interested in the titles because they're going to change. Well, what do you want? I said, something that sounds like nothing and everything. And what is that? Strategic initiatives. I am a strategist. I see the world is changing. I'm moving with it. I'm moving with and I don't care who's not coming along. I'm interested in who's coming along. And so for me, there has been no separation. It is my life as a human being on this planet who has been moved in so many situations where I was not considered educated. Like, do I look like I have a PhD when I walk around in my shorts and sneakers? No, and nobody cares. And that's the way the world is. But how do I get the people who have something to say, who have chosen the arts to say it, into a position where they understand that they can? Because those are the people, for me in my life, even as an adult, I did not know Black women were scientists at NASA until I saw Hidden Figures. And I studied science. I studied biology. I was going to be a physician, which is, by the way, where I found out that we're all the same biologically. So, the titles are nice. To do the work is nice. To get it recognized is nice. To put money and resource into it. To have, but you know what? The institution is people and what they do.
Yeah. That's great. And you have the same title, Strategic
Yeah, I know, we
Initiatives.
both, I was going to say,
And
I
I was supposed to choose my own title and I said Faculty Initiatives, kind of.
Yeah,
Again,
and actually
very
my official title on the ground is strategery.
Oh,
Because like my colleague spoke about, I got the job for something I was doing already, stealth.
yeah.
So, which is what you're doing. That's by the way, the best way to do it is stealth. Because if it's in your title, people are looking at you and looking for you. But if you're stealth, you know, like the way she's political. I'm stealth.
Okay.
I'm diplomatic.
There's that. Anyway, thank you.
Well, do you want to go to JJ? Okay. Well, so Neetu, if I remember, I mean, you had asked us to talk about sort of challenges in higher ed, relevance for this cohort. So, when I was thinking about this before, and I think this jives with your comments, I mean, I was thinking about the recent Supreme Court decision, right, to strike down affirmative action in undergraduate admissions, and as a starting point for this conversation, and because that is a decision which it casts a much wider pall on the academy, right? It's not just about undergraduate admissions, as important as that is. Now it's left us in a place in higher education where people just don't know what is admissible or not. How about graduate admissions? How about faculty recruitment? How about scholarship programs? What is it that is going to be, ruled out? And of course, at the same time, as you know, there are also all of these political efforts to circumscribe even the curriculum of what we can take. So, right, what we can teach, right? It can be through the K-12 level, right, where you have legislators across the country trying to ban the discussion of certain subjects. But also we see, for example, in Florida, and this hit home for me as a sociologist, the recent decision to strike sociology, for example, from their curriculum, their core curriculum. Why? Because we teach about racism, and we teach about sexism, and we teach about homophobia, and we teach about classism. I mean, we teach about all the things that these legislators are suggesting we should not be talking about and don't actually exist. And all of this, so we're in this really challenging political climate. And, the overall message that we're seeing in the academy specifically, right, is that women in the academy, people of color, are being targeted, being sort of, we're getting the sense that they're like illegitimate members of the academy. If we think about what happened to Claudine Gay and to the president of UPenn after Congress, I hear now they're going to re-invite the president of Columbia.
Tomorrow.
Right,
President
tomorrow.
of
Columbia, right.
Yeah.
She thought she had sidestepped that by saying I'm busy, but now they like called her back.
was
No, I
in-
think for
she
the
was at
first
the-
time, the first hearing she was supposed, the one at Claudine Gay, and she's like, I have a prior commitment apparently.
In Dubai.
But now, so really interesting, right? As if there were only women leading the Ivy League, right?
Exactly.
So, right, so
Exactly.
only women leaders are being called up for this kind of scrutiny. So clearly,
coincidence.
it's just coincidence,
Do you
right?
think they'll call ours?
Let's hope not.
I
There's a rumor in the
it could
there's been a rumor.
happen. I think that if they do that, they will get a run for their money, because I think Linda Mill will teach them a thing or two if she goes up there. But we'll see. I hope she won't get called up. But it's really consistent with this, broader backlash
Yeah,
against
exactly.
this, sending this message to society that women, that people of color don't have any business leading our top educational institutions. They're illegitimate. And it's part of a broader political moment if we think also about the overturning of Roe v. Wade, right? This trying to go back to what people think was some traditional natural order of things, which didn't involve, women in the workplace. It didn't involve women leading top institutions and so forth. So that, unfortunately, is the climate that you guys are starting your academic careers in. And, when I think about that, what I think that will mean for you going forward is that, you're going to have a certain wariness and cautious. You're going to have to be navigating a very challenging landscape, professional landscape. Now, I think on one hand, I don't think that we are, going back to the 1940s, right? I don't think, I think that that even the most conservative forces are not going to be able to put the genie of racial pluralism back in the bottle. So I don't think we're going back to a society where people are overtly like, oh, there's there shouldn't be people of color in the room or whatever. Like I don't think we're going back to that. But where we are going, I think, is to a situation where there is just going to be less legal and institutional support for measures to diversify our profession. So the GIDBEA is just, they're just going to be fewer tools, fewer resources for that. I mean, we see that across the nation, that universities with offices devoted to IDBE are being forced to close. Some of them are trying to circumvent it by renaming themselves or describing their missions differently, but in some cases they're not successful, and even those are being forced to close. So all of this is, but like I said, at the same time, I think that as a society, there still is we're still, again, not in the 1940s, that I think the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s has had a real and a lasting impact on the way Americans are thinking about inclusiveness in the in the professional sphere. So what I'm saying is that I think that basically GIDBA is going to have to proceed under the radar to a large extent. There will be, I think, a certain grounding of support for having an academy that is fairly inclusive, that is not blatantly exclusive the way it used to be, blatantly exclusionary. But we're not going to be able to do it with the kinds of tools that people like in our generation had. Like they're not going to be the same sort of existence of explicit programs, explicit tools that say, yes, we think it's important to have an academy that represents our society broadly. Those tools and resources are going to be there to much more limited extent. And it's going to be felt in the makeup of the academy that unfortunately, you guys, there are going to be ways in which you are going to feel othered to speak to Dana's term, have experiences of being a token, the only one. Unfortunately, those kinds of experiences, which are familiar to us from our, our generation, preceding generations, is still going to be your experience. We're not, I think I used to think naively that, we were kind of making social progress in this linear upward way, and maybe sometimes it was slow or stalled a little bit, but that kind of the trend was always like this. And now, I mean, the events of recent years have really forced me to rethink that. But again, I think that there will be more resources and support out there for GIDBA principles than are immediately apparent on the explicit surface, but it will require this careful navigation. And sometimes, again, sort of operating under the radar to try to bring about a more equitable academy. So,
all right, thank you. No, that was wonderful.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll finish with Dana.
Yeah,
Wrap up.
it's-
For just, I know we're running a few minutes, but
Oh.
this has been a wonderful panel.
Yep.
One of the best GIDBA panels I've had.
Oh,
Thank
that's
you.
exciting to hear.
So I'm
That's
gonna let it go for
Yep.
a few more minutes,
Yes,
5
take it away.
minutes,
Okay,
6
okay.
minutes maybe.
Well, I
including
love
their
to
questions.
hear from my colleagues because they've shared such beautiful insights and really critical and important ones. And all of us, I think, have a slightly different perspective on these topics. And I would say that the biggest threats or challenges, as Niyati asked us to speak about challenges, the biggest challenges that I see in the moment are, and in the near future, are two or threefold. And the first I would put under the category of difficult conversations. So folks who share views different to our own, and sometimes views that we might find repugnant. Many people do not want to even talk to those people anymore. And that is something that I see affecting academia in deep, profound ways across all layers and levels of academia, even perhaps most profoundly among our students. And this, I think, is a genuine threat and a real problem. I think all of us should be able to sit down with someone whose views might be repugnant and talk, even if we think that those views violate international law, even if we think, or domestic law, or whatever it may be. I think it's critically important to be able to have conversations, and maybe not public ones. Maybe that's the place where it becomes really uncomfortable, because no one wants to give a platform to a view that is, that repugnant. But being able to sit in a room and have a private conversation with someone whose views are so different to ours, I think that's a critical element. I think it's integral to academia, and it's critical to the classroom as well. I think having open debates in the classroom, making people feel comfortable to say whatever they feel, I think that's an unpopular position right now. And I don't mean it as a conservative one, actually, but I think that it is important that people be able to share ideas and opinions that are radically different. If they can't share them, then there's no changing them. So, and maybe that's I'm letting my bias shine, because of course I don't, I mean, radical repugnant views in my classroom, I think it would be very challenging to handle, but I would rather hear them than have them go silent. And So that's point number one. I don't know that I have an answer to that question, but I do personally, professionally, I think it's important to have private conversations with people whose views are very different from mine. The second challenge that I see is maybe a much smaller challenge, but maybe equally insidious, is ignorance. And ignorance among very, very smart people of the other. So ignorance that I find, in all areas of academia, at all institutions, including our own, I'm shocked sometimes by sometimes people's understandings of some other cultural norms or another place that I find really actually quite genuinely surprising. Someone who is super smart, who I personally like a lot, but might hold views that are, and that person, if that person knew otherwise, wouldn't hold those views, right? And we've all probably encountered people of that who have this is like the single story. I mean, that piece really speaks to that issue, I think, actually. So I think that is a challenge. It continues to be a challenge. And the third challenge I'm going to talk about is existential. It's climate change. And when you think about us, NYU, the global network university, with campuses, full portal campuses in Shanghai and Abu Dhabi, and the degree of movement and mobility that we require among faculty and students and deans and administration flying around the world to support and manage our global campuses, and I include myself as one of those folks doing that. That's part of, if international education isn't moving students and faculty around the world, I don't know who is. So this is how to manage that kind of mobility in the face of the kinds of climate change effects that we will see in the coming years that are going to dwarf the current refugee migrant challenges we're facing today.
Wow.
Sorry, that's not the brightest note.
I wish that was existential. I think that's
Yes,
it's
not
not existential.
Not existential.
I think it is. We are beyond the fact the moment where we can call it existential.
So okay, thank you. So maybe one positive note. I don't want to leave it there. That is really just not where I want to be in my day. I don't want to be on that point. So, I think I'd love to hear from you about the brilliant ideas. One idea that I thought we should all do, bringing these concepts together, is I think every single faculty member at NYU should be putting climate change messages on their curriculum, like actually crowdsourcing from the students. Really local things. What's your favorite climate change solution? Bamboo toothbrushes. What's your, whatever it is. Where do you buy what do you do to minimize your impact in your daily life? And something like that we add, maybe the way we add all of our, I can't remember our acronym now,
GIDBEA.
Thank you.
But yeah, that's a great, let's actually move to them
Please,
and see
yes.
if anyone has any comments to share or questions for the panel before we move on to the next part of the program.
Yeah, you got one over there.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your work and your insights with us. As someone who's early career and chairing a diversity and equity, inclusion and belonging committee for a national organization, one of the things I struggle with is that I'm in New York, and that's given me a little bit of privilege in the DEIB space, because I can talk freely about these topics. And many of the members of my committee live in states where it's been outlawed. And I don't really have a question. I just wanted to sort of share that's like another layer of complexity that's been sort of added onto our work. And people often say to me, like, well, you can speak so freely about this. I can't. What do you think I should do? And then I'm like stuck trying to find solutions, to help someone in Alabama or Florida. And it's like that. I just wanted to share that's been like a real challenge.
It's a very real thing, but again, in my early career, we practice it without using the language. We use there are other ways. There are other ways that you can talk about kindness, generosity, humanist language. So, for me, this is not a difficult time. I'm going back stealth. which means I use different language. You know, I come from the church, so I have a lot of churchy language, right? I come from a practice that came out of my church about mind, body, spirit health, about community, so we can change the language and get the same results. And so I would encourage you to do that. You know, we don't have to use, even when we started, actually, a lot of our faculty were against it because they didn't understand the lingo. Well, let's just go back to regular old words.
And I'm in healthcare, so now we're reframing around
Care.
health equity and care.
Yeah.
There, yeah.
And communities of care, which, you know, if we don't know that, then, you know.
Maybe we have
Yeah.
time for one more question and then.
I have two parts. One is a very quick question. The other one is a response to this conversation. Another thing that I think I hear what you're saying, and I come up against that with colleagues a lot as well. I try to think of myself as being in a position of privilege in a way that can be helpful, right? So I'm a librarian, so I think about, you know, maybe a librarian at a university that is restricting access to IDBA kinds of materials can't order XYZ books, but I can, and they can get them through the library loan, right? Maybe they can't have a research guide on IDBA topics that's publicly available on their website, but I can, and their students can come see this one.
Yeah.
Right. So I try to think about like what can I kind of stealthily do from NYU to use that kind of position of privilege to benefit not only students and faculty at NYU, but students and faculty at these universities that don't have that access. I'm just going to throw that idea into the conversation.
Thank you.
Great, yeah.
And then I had a super quick question for Anne, which is just the book that you were talking about earlier, where you're thinking through race in U.S. context versus global context. Is
Yes.
that an ugly word?
It is.
Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for your interest. Thank you.
Great. This has been excellent, excellent, excellent. Thank you so much.